So today we come to the end of chapter 6 of John's Gospel, and with that to the end of our 5-week series of homilies on the Eucharist. As I said 5 weeks ago, our goal has been to help you fall more deeply in love with Jesus in the Mass. We wanted to help you to pray the Mass more deeply, because we're not spectators in the Mass, we're participants. I do hope that you feel like you've been on a journey over the last 5 weeks, perhaps from being bored at week 1 to knowing that you're to offer your hearts and minds to God with the gifts of bread and wine, and in return to receive the very gift of Jesus himself in Holy Communion. I also really hope that your faith in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist has deepened. As we heard in the Gospel today, many of Jesus' original followers found Jesus' teaching that we heard last week, that the bread and the wine become his body and blood, a hard saying, unacceptable, and they decided to leave him at this point. And it is possible that you might be thinking, okay, I understand, I think, what the church teaches about the bread and wine becoming the very presence of Jesus, but I'm still struggling to believe that because my eyes mislead me. It still looks like bread and wine. It still tastes like bread and wine. Furthermore, maybe it might be I've been coming to Mass a long time, and sometimes that might feel consoling or comforting to be here, but I'm not sure that I'm being drawn into communion with God in the way that you've been talking about over these weeks, Father Chris. Well, Jesus' words in the Gospel today are about this very issue. He says that it's the Spirit that gives life and that the flesh is useless. The words I have spoken, says Jesus, are spirit and life, but there are some of you who don't believe. So Jesus is saying here that we're to have faith, to trust in the words that Jesus has given to us. Because the flesh, in this case our eyes, our physical eyes, do mislead us. And we have to penetrate with our hearts to the depths of the mystery. As the Little Prince says in St Exupery's beautiful little book, it's only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. I also think that one of the things that can hinder us, that can be an obstacle to us in seeing rightly, in tasting rightly too in the Eucharist, is that it's all over so quickly. The moment of communion, that moment where we receive Jesus in the Eucharist, is over in just a few moments. By the time you've returned to your seat, the host is dissolved in your mouth, and so you're invited then to spend some more time in contemplation and thanksgiving for the extraordinary gift that you've received, Jesus himself. This is why kneeling for those moments after you've received communion is the appropriate posture for this time of prayer. It signifies the communion that you've entered into with God. But even that time after communion is over quite quickly. To more deeply appreciate the gift of the communion that we've received, we need contemplation. Communion and contemplation go together. Well, what is contemplation then? It's about seeing the one that we love. Think about the way this works in our personal relationships. We can't communicate with another person at any depth without actually really knowing him or her. So if we're truly to commune with Jesus, if we're to be one with him in Holy Communion, then we need to contemplate him, to gaze upon him, to let him gaze upon us, to listen to him, and so get to know him better. It's this truth that led to the development in the Church of Adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. That's the devotion by which we place a consecrated host in a stand upon the altar. We call that stand a monstrance. And we do this precisely in order to gaze upon Jesus and for him to gaze upon us. As Pope Benedict XVI once said, Eucharistic adoration is nothing more than the explicit development of the Eucharist. Receiving the Eucharist means adoring the one that we receive. It is then, and only then, that we become one with him, and we taste in advance, in some way, the beauty of the heavenly liturgy. Adoration outside of Mass, exposition of the Blessed Sacrament, prolongs and intensifies everything that takes place during the Mass. In fact, it's only adoration that can mature into a profound receiving of Jesus. Pope Francis has made the same point. He puts it a little more simply. He says, let's also rediscover Eucharistic adoration, which continues the work of the Mass within us. This will do us much good, for it heals us within, especially now when our need is so great. As missionaries of God's love, we spend an hour a day in adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. We take to heart what one of our patron saints, the great Saint Alphonsus Liguori, says: of all devotions, that of adoring Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament is the greatest after the sacraments, the one dearest to God and the one most helpful to us. So my message this morning here is really very simple. Adoration deepens communion. If you want your experience of Sunday Eucharist to truly be a taste of heaven, if you want it to be a real, though partial, experience even now of eternal life, come and adore Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. It will change the way that you show up, that you're present when you come to Mass on Sundays. Now, one of the lines that I repeated a number of times over the last 5 weeks is that we don't go to Mass because we're Catholic because we go to Mass. We speak as a church of the obligation to go to Mass every Sunday, for which being sick is the only valid excuse, and it is an obligation. Furthermore, we shouldn't receive Holy Communion if we missed Sunday Mass and if we haven't been to reconciliation, to confession first. People often object to these requirements from the church. We don't like obligations in our day and age, and many people would say that what makes us true Christians isn't so much about whether we show up in church or not, but whether we love our neighbour. Now, the litmus test of our faith is whether we love our neighbour or not. But have you ever noticed just how hard it is to love your neighbour sometimes? Where do we get the energy? Where do we get the power to love our neighbour, if not from the Eucharist, if not from communion, if not from where we receive the very love of Jesus that in turn empowers us to love one another? As we heard before Mass started this morning, the Australian bishops ask us to mark today as Social Justice Sunday. And in their statement this year, they've particularly focused upon the need for truth and for peace in a violent world. Well, where do we find truth and peace so that we might share it with others? Again, it's in the Mass. In the Mass, we listen to the truth of the gospel. It's in the Mass that we discover Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life. It's in the Mass that we experience and encounter the peace of Jesus so that we might offer that to others. There can be no true social justice as far as Catholics are concerned if it doesn't emanate from the Eucharist. Adoration of the Blessed Sacrament and justice, adoration and love for the poor also go together. Perhaps the most powerful witness to this is from Mother Teresa and her Missionaries of Charity. The Missionaries of Charity did not initially have daily adoration of the Blessed Sacrament in their convents. Mother Teresa was inspired to introduce this practice, and she said this about it: "Since we've exposed the Blessed Sacrament every day, we have perceived a change in our lives," speaking of her sisters. We felt a deeper love for Christ disguised in the poor. Since we started Adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, we've not reduced our work. We spend as much time with the poor as before, but with more understanding. The holy hour before the Eucharist must direct us to the holy hour with the poor. The holy hour before the Eucharist must direct us to the holy hour with the poor. True communion with Jesus in the Eucharist and in adoration sends us out to be instruments of communion with one another, with those suffering, and with all those who do not yet know the love of God. So let's return and conclude by going to the words of St Peter in today's Gospel. When Jesus asks the 12, his closest followers, whether they too will leave because of his teaching about the Eucharist, Peter says, "To whom shall we go? You, Jesus, have the words of eternal life, and we believe." Where do we go if we want eternal life? Where do we go if we want to be caught up in communion, in the love that is God? We go to Mass.